tonight, we have a really unusual group of people. And we've sort of confabulated an interesting idea to look at two wars, America's two most recent wars of consequence, namely the war in Indochina, Vietnam, and Iraq. And it's perhaps no accident that several of the people you'll be hearing from and whose work you'll see shortly have covered both wars and both countries. There is a kind of a fraternity of these very curious people who are war photographers and even war correspondents who tend to travel around together. It gets to be something of a, as Chris Hedges wrote in his very interesting book, something of a narcotic. The first photographer is Catherine Leroy. She was 21 years old when she went to Vietnam. It's interesting, all of these people were very young in Vietnam. Her work has been published very widely. She got captured by the Viet Cong in Vietnam and then was released. She's won many prizes, including the Robert Capa Award, a Peabody Award, and is truly one of the great photographers, documentary photographers of this genre. Don McCullin tells me he was 28 when he went to Vietnam for the first time. And as he just noted to me, he's been to lots of wars. They include Vietnam, Biafra, Cyprus, the Congo, Beirut, and others. He lamentably missed the Falklands War. He was just telling me, because Margaret Thatcher, taking note of the effect of the media and photography in Vietnam, did not want to let the likes of him intrude on that nice little war. He's written or photographed for a long time for the Sunday Times, and his work has really gotten to be quite a legend in the world of photography. David Leeson has been a staff photographer at the Dallas Morning News, was embedded during the initial invasion of Iraq, and subsequently won a Pulitzer Prize for his work there. Finally, we have two other people. Mike Cerre is the executive producer of Globe Television, but also has had a really distinguished career working for the networks, most recently for Nightline. He too was embedded, interestingly, with the very regiment with which he fought in Vietnam, the 5th Marine Regiment, which means that he has seen both wars and from very different perspectives of soldier and correspondent. Finally, we have Jonathan Schell, who happens to be my brother. I think he was 21, is that right, Jonathan, wherever you are, when you went to Vietnam, sort of stumbled into it and began writing some of the most wonderful stuff about the war for the New Yorker magazine. It came out in long serial form. One was serialized in a book, The Village of Ben Suk, which told of the famous village that was destroyed in order to save it. And then ultimately, having covered the ground war in Vietnam, covered the air war in a series of articles for The New Yorker, and it came out as a book called The Military Half. He now writes a column for The Nation and is at the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. Now, to kick this off, I'm going to ask Ken Light to come up. Ken has really labored long and hard on this program at the Graduate School of Journalism. We've had some amazing exhibits, and there are many more wonderful exhibits to come. We've had Marc Ribot, the great French photographer, Wayne Miller, who may be here tonight, former Magnum photographer, Sebastião Salgado, Micha Barham from Israel, Susan Meiselas, who's also here tonight, Antonin Kratachville, among others. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to have this very visual sort of representation of journalism right within the hallways of our school. It makes those walls less bare, and actually, I think, provides another very necessary facet of journalists at work. So Ken, without further ado, please come up and we'll see the little show you put together on history of war photography, and then some of the photography of the people who we'll talk with later. Thanks very much for coming.
Good evening. From photography's beginning in the mid-19th century, its practitioners have been aware of the power of the photograph to narrate, depict, expose, and persuade. The history of photography reveals a host of photographers who have turned their cameras and their eyes to the conflicts and wars of their time. Even with the crudest tools, glass plate negatives, large and cumbersome view cameras, impossible field conditions, these early image makers were armed with a deep need to witness their time over and over again. The visual record they created has become our conscious knowledge of the great conflicts of the last 150 years. Photography found its greatest champions among those who had a heart for its challenge, an eye for its creative possibilities. If, as they say, the truth is the first casualty in the fog of war, the independent photographers who focused on the world's conflicts and the people caught up in them have at least helped us to peer through the mist of time. This evening we have the opportunity to be part of a wonderful conversation with Orville Schell about the images of war and the words that amplify them. Orville also went to Vietnam in 1961 and 1967, writing for newspapers and also for magazines such as The New Republic and Atlantic Monthly. As Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism, he has fostered these very important conversations about the modern state of journalism. Tonight we will hear about and see many of the images that have been an important record of our history and many images that many of you will remember. It is a chance to look back at Vietnam, a war that ended 30 years ago, and also see and hear about the war we are now fighting in Iraq. No war has ever been photographed like Vietnam. It produced a relentless flow of pictures that took people to places they had never seen in such depth and gave us an up-close view of the battlefield. But before we start this conversation, I want to take you back to the beginnings of photography and share a small selection of photo history by some of photography's greatest image makers who have witnessed and reported on war. Roger Fenton photographed the Crimean War in 1855. Fenton made the first extensive record of war, and this is in fact a photograph of Roger Fenton in his photographic van. Fenton's images were taken under the patronage of Her Majesty the Queen, and partly because of this support there were no images of bloated corpses, emancipated, wounded, or sick soldiers racked by cholera. Fenton made formal portraits of officers and topographical landscapes of the terrain where the conflict was fought. One early image, the Valley of the Shadow of Death, has come to symbolize early war photography and shows a bleak, shallow valley strewn with cannonballs. Timothy O'Sullivan, The American Civil War. The American Civil War was the first war photographed systematically from the beginning to the end by professional photographers. Many of the war images were credited to the photographer Matthew Brady, who is pictured here. Brady, whose self-promotion during this period has meant that his name has become synonymous with Civil War photography to the unfair exclusion of the photographers actually under his employ. Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan, two Brady photographers, used a cumbersome wet plate process and recorded the Union Army's campaigns and illustrated the landscape of war. The photos of bloated corpses lying on the battlefield caused a sensation when first published as wood engravings in popular journals, which were then the only means photos could be mass-produced. The halftone process that we use today to reproduce images was not invented until decades later. Their photos began a debate about the political correctness of such photographs that has continued to this day. André Cortège, World War I. This is a photograph of André Cortège, who photographed World War I and is known as a great modernist photographer. The Great War had surprisingly few accounts of war photography, largely because of heavy-handed military censorship. It was the first war where news was managed to such an extent that photography was limited largely to the inoffensive due to an obsession with secrecy. However, by this time, many people, at least people from the middle class, had cameras of their own. And some of the more interesting records came from soldiers who took their cameras with them as amateurs, Among these were some who later became famous and renowned photographers, including Cortège. During the war, he photographed his fellow soldiers and also the countryside and the people there. Wounded in 1915, Cortège was hospitalized for almost 9 months. Robert Capa, the Spanish Civil War. This is a photograph of Robert Capa filming, one of the many films he made, and also was a still photographer. The Spanish Civil War witnessed the birth of modern photojournalism and the birth of the modern war photographer, exemplified by Robert Capa. Writer John Hershey tells a story how the Hungarian political refugee, André Friedman, took off for Paris with his girlfriend, Gerda Taro. Gerda was to serve as secretary and sales representative for their photos. André was to be the darkroom hired hand, and these two were to be employed by a rich, famous, talented, and imaginary American photographer named Robert Capa, then allegedly visiting France. The three went to work. Friedman took the pictures, Gerda sold them, and the credit was given the non-existent Capa. Since this Capa was supposed to be so rich, Gerda refused to let his pictures go to any French newspaper for less than 150 francs apiece, 3 times the prevailing rate. The secret was soon found out by editor Lucien Vogel of Vous, but it did not matter. He sent Capa and Gerda to Spain, where Capa became famous overnight for his remarkable picture of a dying Spanish soldier. Gerda stayed on, meeting her death on the battlefield. Capa covered the Spanish War until its end in early 1939. His use of the newly invented 35mm rangefinder camera allowed him to make images that brought us closer to war than had ever been seen in the modern media. Sadly, Capa died in 1954, photographing the Indochina War for Life magazine. David Douglas Duncan, the Korean War. This is a photograph of David Douglas Duncan in Korea. In June of 1950, when North Korea began invading South Korea along the 38th parallel, Life magazine photographer David Douglas Duncan beat the first U.S. Marines into the country and then continued to supply images and stories from the field. In December of that year, he accompanied the Marines in their ultimately futile attempt to invade North Korea. Massively outnumbered by invading Chinese forces, the Americans were forced to fight their way out of an entrapment on the Chosin Reservoir, and they staged a dramatic withdrawal under enemy fire for more than 30 miles and trapped in blizzards and freezing conditions. The Marines struggled on, carrying their dead and wounded until they reached the coast and safe evacuation. Duncan fought his way out with them, returning with even more stunning photographs of men in the hell of warfare. Tonight, we are happy to have 3 contemporary photographers with us. Catherine Leroy, as Orville said, was 21 when she set out for her native France to Vietnam in 1966. And that's Catherine smiling at work. In less than 2 years, her intrepid reporting made her one of the war's most published photographers. In 1967, she became the only journalist to partake in a combat jump. Later, she was wounded with a Marine unit in the DMZ. Catherine was captured by the North Vietnamese Regular Army during the Tet Offensive, but managed to talk her way free. This was published as a cover and inside story in Life magazine. She has won numerous prizes for her work in Vietnam and elsewhere, including the Robert Capa Award, of which she was the first female recipient, and the George Polk Award. She is the author of the just published Under Fire, Great Photographers and Writers in Vietnam, which, as Orville said, is outside the auditorium, signed by both Catherine and Don, and I hope you'll pick up a copy when you leave. Gilles Caron took these photographs of Catherine while she was working in Vietnam. Karen, who also has photographs in the Under Fire book, was later killed by the Khmer Rouge. And these are some of Catherine's photographs. And this is the cover story that Life magazine ran on Catherine's photographs after she was released by the North Vietnamese army. And these are some of her color photographs she made while in Vietnam. Don McCullin is recognized as one of the greatest of war and conflict photographers, and throughout the 1960s and 1970s, he covered events of global importance for the Sunday Times Magazine, including the Vietnam War. His first published story was in 1958 and concerned his own street gang in North London, and his subsequent images in Britain have looked at the unemployed and the destitute. Abroad, McCullin has covered the war-torn regions of the world, documenting events normally hidden from view. His work proved so painful and memorable that in 1982 he was forbidden to cover the Falklands Road by the wars by the British government. He has continued to photograph, including landscapes, and has most recently completed a major photo project on AIDS in Africa. These photographs, taken during the Tet Offensive, are shown in the chronological order that Don witnessed. He spent a dozen days in Hue, the former imperial capital of Vietnam, in 1968, making these photographs. David Leeson has been a staff photographer for the Dallas Morning News since 1984. In 1991, David arrived in Kuwait City with the 1st Marine Division and was among the first journalists to photograph in the city following Iraq's withdrawal during the Gulf War. The following year, he returned to the Gulf and gave readers an exclusive look inside war-torn Baghdad. In 1994, he covered the civil war in Angola. In 2003, he was an embedded journalist during the invasion of Iraq. The unit he was assigned to saw an Army record of 23 days of sustained enemy conflict. David won a Pulitzer Prize for his work in the war last year. That's David. Thank you very much, and will our guests come up?
I think it was abundantly evident that sometimes a photograph does say things infinitely more powerfully than words. And it makes me wonder, and I thought maybe we just go down the table. Each of you quickly tell us, how did you all get involved in covering war and wars? What, did you have this intention, or did you just happen to stumble into it? And what kept you doing it? Don?
Oh, in the beginning, it all seemed rather exciting, and I was weaned on the Hollywood films from the Second World War. So when I finally became a photographer, I never planned to become a photographer. I'd finished my military service and came out of the Air Force with a camera, but I didn't know what to do with it. But I went to Berlin and photographed the wall, and I came back and I worked for the Observer newspaper. And I went into the office one day and they said, how would you feel like going to the Civil War in Cyprus? And I of course, you know, as a young photographer, to be suddenly invited to get involved in, you know, in the center stage of the world's best story, you know, you couldn't say no, and I went. And I quickly understood the idea that, you know, looking at Hollywood films, there never seemed to be any bleeding, and there never seemed to be any real war. It was all very romantic. And when I first saw my dead body in Cyprus, then I realized that it was a totally different experience. So I had to quickly come to terms with looking at my first dead body. And the only dead body I'd ever seen in my life at that stage was my own father, who had died when I was a young boy. So I suddenly found myself looking down at a Turkish Cypriot man who had half a face. And then this British soldier said to me, by the way, there's 3 more in there, in the house behind. He was talking about these dead people as if they were, you know, not of the human race. That's how I started my life in war photography.
Well, A little bit. I have this common story to share with Don. I had seen a lot of movies and Hollywood movies, but that's a little bit beside the point. I wanted to become a photojournalist because I had seen for many years Paris Match, which was the equivalent of Life magazine. It was a French Life magazine, and those extraordinary stories, not only of war, but I must say the work that was reproduced in this magazine was to me extraordinary, and photojournalists were my real heroes. And I remember in 1956 in Budapest there was a young photographer by the name of Jean-Pierre Pedrazzini, and he was killed by Russian tanks, and I was absolutely devastated. And of course I was familiar with the work of Robert Capa.
Maybe, yes, thanks, Jim.
And I was familiar with the work of Robert Capa, and photojournalists were my heroes, and this is what I wanted to do. To me, photojournalism was a formidable window to the world, and I could identify with the power of the image, and this is what I wanted to do. So I saved money, I bought a Leica, I started to photograph in Paris, and I saved money to buy a one-way ticket to Saigon, and I arrived in Vietnam in the spring of 1966. I spoke 3 words of English, and this is how it all started.
Well, I'm actually not sure how I ended up here. I was just as perplexed being invited to be here, but with these wonderful people who were so influential in my life. I've told the story of picking up Don's book when I was just a young man in Abilene at the Abilene Public Library, and it influenced me throughout my life and stuck with me throughout my career. However, I really never sought to do this. In fact, today I'm very uncomfortable with being referred to as a war photographer, a conflict photographer, even though Iraq was my 11th conflict in 20 years. I'm a newspaper photographer, and actually I think I always was terrified of answering the question and asking myself, why? Why do you do it? Until possibly Iraq. And I think maybe deep down, as I really wrestled with this, why? Why would you do this? Because, you know, lots of people make sacrifices when we're out there. I know both of these people would attest to that, and people at this table, the sacrifices made by families and by loved ones and by friends. That it's one thing for me to say, I'll go out and do this because I believe in it and because it's a mission and because of this and that. But it's another one to watch as your mother and your father are stricken with absolute worry over their son's life. And so I often wondered, and actually it came down to, there is a sense of mission that has driven me. I can't speak for the others in that area, but I know that it's been my desire to make a difference, to hopefully touch your life in some way, to get you to stop for one moment over your cup of coffee in the morning and possibly consider the blessings that in your own life and the way that you live. So, but here I am, and it's quite an honor to be here.
Mike.
Well, I was hoping to be a combat correspondent rather than a combatant, but it didn't work out that way for me in Vietnam. In fact, I can remember the training officer, as I was graduating as a young lieutenant, he said, what did you study in school? And I said, film and journalism. He says, well, we have the perfect assignment for you. You're going into tanks. and I kind of looked at him somewhat incredulously. I said, well, fine, that's better than the infantry, but what does that have to do with film and journalism? He said, well, you know, the film goes around sprockets like this, tank track the same way. You'll get along great. That was, and if you know anything about the United States Marine Corps, it makes perfect sense. So I was able to observe the work of Don, and we saw the books, we saw the pictures before we went to Vietnam. And so those images were very indelible. So being a combatant in Vietnam, when I got out, I wanted to be a journalist. And it really kind of came to roost for me in this recent war in Iraq that I really just wanted to bear witness. As a lot of journalists got all excited, you know, a war can make someone's career very quickly. And there's this heady enthusiasm as the drums of war beat, and everyone gets excited about a big story. But few people really understand the carnage and the suffering that I think David and Don were talking about, and Catherine, that when you get up close and personal to it, it's far more than a story. And I was quite amazed by my fellow embedded journalists being almost very excited. I remember, David, when they took us out to the tents and you got assigned the unit, everything was looking great until they told you about the antidote shots, the gas, and if you're doing the funky chicken on the deck, to give the guy this shot and whatever. And all the journalists started to say, this is serious stuff. And I think that's what really got me to try to do it one more time in Iraq, was I thought that I could maybe bear witness to what was going on, make some analogies to Vietnam and having been a combatant before. And through the whole process, I kind of felt I know where the story is going. There was no doubt it was going to be a military victory, but I knew the lives of all the people I was with were going to change very dramatically. And as an embedded journalist, I wanted to record that, and hopefully we might learn something from it.
Jonathan?
Well, my method was sheer accident. There were no intentions involved, or almost none. I'd been in Japan, where I'd been really a kind of a fake graduate student with one eye on the draft breathing down my neck. And on my way back in late 1966, December, I happened to have a ticket by the now defunct Pan Am Airlines that permitted me to stop in anywhere I wanted in the world, and in as many places as I wanted in the world. So I picked Hong Kong, Saigon, Kathmandu, and London. And stop number 2 was Saigon. I had one phone number in my wallet. I can't even imagine how I had that one, because it was of a French journalist called François Souly, who had taken his meals at my dining hall at college, and I'd gotten to know him a little bit. Somehow I'd carried that phone number around with me. So I called my one phone number. François was there. He was at Newsweek. He invited me over. Went into the Newsweek office, and he greeted me. And I'd been reading on the way in order to know something, anything at all about Vietnam. I'd been reading Two Vietnams by the great French writer Bernard Fall. And I had that book under my arm. There was another gentleman in the room there, and he said to me, "What are you reading?" And I said, "I'm reading Two Vietnams by Bernard Fall." And he said, "Can I see it?" So I handed it to him, and he opened it up, and he signed it, and that was Bernard Fall. And this was arguably a moment that truly set the direction of at least my life, I would have to say, because those two Frenchmen, wonderful, high-spirited war correspondents who both were tragically killed in the war not long after I came to know them, just out of sheer high spirits and ebullience, took on this pest of a fake graduate student who knew nothing about Vietnam but imagined he'd like to write something. And they did a second thing for me, which was they engineered for me a press pass on the false grounds that I was there for the Harvard Crimson. It wasn't true, but it did get me that press pass. I'll stop the story there. That press pass turned out to be a magical pass. Sort of like a all-Europe rail pass, except you could go on the planes, you could go in the tanks, you could live on the bases, you could hitchhike with helicopters from one place to another. It was wide open. You could go out and see the war once you had that press pass. That's how it started.
That's an amazing sort of permission slip, but of course you entered the world of the military. It's interesting that in all of the years of the Vietnam War, 66 journalists died. So far in Iraq, 39 have died, and we're only, a few years into it. It strikes me rather odd that at least we as Americans, and I don't know if this is true of the French and the British or others, we seem to learn our geography by going to war in strange places we know nothing about. I remember when people discovered Bernard Fall, and that the fact that the French had been in Indochina for, what was it, 100 years, and actually been writing about it. I wonder, do you all who've now been around the block a few times, do you think your journalism makes as much difference as it used to?
Shall I say something? Okay.
Please, you don't even need to ask, Don.
I've been doing it an awful long time. What worries me most of all is there is even more wars appearing, each year. And I ask myself, what have I been doing for the last 30 years? Have I made any difference? I did a book in 1972 saying, is anyone taking any notice? And quite frankly, I think everything I've done seems to be almost a waste of time. You have new wars appearing. The Iraq War hasn't been settled. The Vietnam War was a disaster. And ask yourself, what's been achieved in the last 30 years? I feel really disturbed about it. And I really disown the idea. And I'm not saying this to try and, get any points here. I really disown the idea that what I did in those 30 years, and all the risk I took, and has ever made any difference. Because, in fact, every year the wars seem to be becoming more ugly, and more of them to choose from if you want to go to them.
Well, I was doing a story. This may sound off the topic, but it's not, so stick with me for just a moment. I was doing a story in 1986. I lived with the homeless for 2 months, and I was astonished with my naivety of not realizing that such things took place right there in one of the richest cities in the United States, Dallas, Texas. But I met a Father Hill, and he told me about being in the seminary, and he really wanted to help the homeless. And he says he really believed in this verse in the Bible that says if you have the faith of a mustard seed, which is just a really tiny thing, then you could move a mountain into the sea. And he says, I really worked hard. I really believed that. But then I found out that I could not move the mountain until I realized I had enough faith to move the mountain one shovel at a time, one individual at a time, to change lives one person at a time. And while I've had throughout my career this quest for a holy grail of changing things, of actually being able to stop war, and must tell you that after winning a Pulitzer Prize, while I accepted that with graciousness and thankfulness for having finally achieved such a thing, at the same time I felt like a total failure because the war was still going on. And I identify with what Don says. But the very fact is that Don mentioned the book, the very book that I pulled off the shelf in Abilene, Texas, that made a profound difference in my life, my personal life, that changed me and the way I viewed the world, who gave me a softer and gentler view. So I often looked at that what I do is I hope that I might look hard upon things, that I might bring those hard things so that you might look more softly upon the world around you. And I think that, Don, that one of the things that you did is that while, yes, all these terrible things go on, this evil persists, and it's so terrifying and it's so upsetting to me personally as well, at the same time you made such a tremendous difference in one person's life. And that was my hope and goal, and I do believe that's possible.
I don't want to hug this conference, but my first experience in Saigon was something that really straightened up my spine. I arrived in Saigon, and somebody said, "Oh, you're just in time. There's going to be an execution tomorrow in the marketplace," as if this was, a kind of gift to me. And I'd never seen anybody executed, let alone in public. And I got down to Cholon in the Chinese section, and the man was a bomber. I've never had much time for people who put bombs in public places. And I have seen the aftermath of a bomb in Saigon which killed all kinds of people directly after the actual bomb blew up. So I went down to the marketplace with all the rest of the journalists, and there was a stake, and there were 2 jeeps, and they were floodlighting the early morning darkness, and a van appeared with the victim, and they had the fire brigade there to wash away the blood afterwards. And there was a jeep clustered with journalists, photographers mostly, trying to get the best view. I couldn't get on the jeep, and I thought, well, you know, what shall I don't know about this. I'm not sure about this. And then the whole fuselage of bullets hit this man who was screaming before the death of himself, you know, down with America, the usual stuff. And amongst all this terrible experience, I heard somebody, a journalist saying, a famous journalist later on, saying, "Great stuff, did you get it?" And in a way it rocked my foundations of the colleagues that I was embarking on as a career, life in photography, photojournalism, whatever, you know. And I remember walking away, and we went to breakfast, and as the dawn was lifting, and I could see the men washing the sidewalk down from, you know, with the blood. The man was shot, and a man came forward and shot him in the head to make sure it was all over. And I was so shocked. I never took one frame, because I was, to this day, disturbed by this man saying, "Great stuff, did you get it?"
Well, that very person is the very thing that you did for me, and you as well, Catherine, to help shape a journalist for today that believes in the very same things and stands for those same principles and ethics, and that I applaud and thank you for, both of you.
I think that as powerful as the images are, both still and video, that war is still very much an abstraction for everyone who's not participated in it. I think people have seen the paintings, they've seen the pictures, they've seen the movies, and all of a sudden another generation comes up and thinks they're immortal and they're not going to die and no one's going to get hurt and it's going to be a victimless war. And what amazed me following the Marines I was embedded with in January of 2003, when there was just the rumor of war, was seeing this progression take place where everyone was going down the path to war. And there was almost kind of an acquiescence to it. And being in the Gulf War, we never really saw, that seemed to be a victimless war. You never really saw a lot of bodies. It was very short. It seemed very painless to the nation. And so what amazed me was that with all the images that we've all seen, here goes another generation sending its best and its brightest off to war. And we seem doing it every 20 years. And the images don't stop the progression. And so I think that there's something about what we do, as powerful as we think it is, it never crosses over to the reality of someone who's not been there to know how horrible it really is. Because if we could communicate how horrible it really is, it wouldn't happen, because it's that bad.
I'd be curious to know from all of you who have, as I said earlier, seen a lot of wars, where is this war in Iraq going? Is this Vietnam all over again? Are we going to be standing on the top in the green zone of the so-called American embassy being airlifted out? What's your analysis? Help us out here. You've seen it. Let's start with you, Don.
Well, I was in Iraq last year, and I spent 2 months being incarcerated in the northern part with the Kurds, because I was in the first war. And we didn't get the promised help from the Kurds, because they were told by the Americans, you know, that they had to come under their command. So we were completely stuffed. We never saw anything, did anything, until I flew south with the Mr. Ahmed Chalabi's mercenaries. He had 600 men who said they were going to fight their way to Baghdad. And it wasn't until I got off the airplane at the other end in the south that I discovered that the American army had taken their weapons away from them. So I was looking at the Fallujah situation, and I was making comparisons, and I've been asked by media in England to make comparisons with the Marines. I'm no expert on the Marines. And they were saying, was it like Vietnam? Well, it wasn't, to some extent, because the Marines in Vietnam, they pulverized the city of Hue, this imperial 16th century copy city, a Chinese city. And they did their very best, it seemed, to do the same to Fallujah. But they were much more in command in Fallujah. They'd learned a lot. They were better equipped and better led. When I was in Vietnam in 1968, there seemed no leadership with the people I was with. But the Fallujah situation, there was a lot more coordination, and it all sounds very impressive and at the same time very boring. But they destroyed Fallujah. So sadly, I mean, the Marines are very brave, and one of the great American kind of stories. And but they don't know how to stop smashing up people's homes and places. And I thought, what is this going to do? What impression is this going to bring to the world? But it really doesn't matter now, because the war has calmed right down. The elections have taken place, to my astonishment. And I suspect really what's going to happen now is that there's going to be a civil war between the Shias and the other crowd, the Sunnis. And and I suspect the Americans are, they can't wait to get out, really, because they're losing men every day. And they paid a high price, really, for policing the world.
Well, I'm very pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic because Iraq is a tribal society, and the allegiance to tribe is even more important than the ethnic, the different group of being Shiite or Sunni or Kurd. It's interesting because the right call the war in Iraq a liberation. So, and it's like World War II. And then the left immediately identify with Vietnam. I think it's going to be a long war. It hasn't even started yet. And I think the American would want to leave as soon as they can.
Would either of you go back again to shoot another round?
No. I've packed in the war business. I don't know about Catherine, but I've packed it in. I mean, why spend 30 years looking at other people's dead bodies and tragedies and, women crying, people looking at you before someone shoots them, and men crying in front of you. I've seen it, and I've had a bellyful of it, and it has not brought any peace to my life, and I defy anybody to go to these places and think there will be any reward to their life or any knowledge or any understanding. So I'm out, that's me, finished.
Well, David, you're, in a certain sense, still have a little tread on the tire. Are you in any hurry to go back to Iraq?
Well, actually, I was hoping to go back in 2005, but my wife had a baby in November 2004. He's a beautiful boy, and it's a second marriage. Unfortunately, my first marriage ended after 19 years, and I have grown children. And I missed a good part of their lives. I missed the first 5 birthdays of my former youngest son's life. And it wasn't too long ago I was looking in my son's eyes, and I thought, I'd really like to do it right this time. I'd like to be here. I'd like to be a dad. I'd like to stay home. And though it's difficult for me, because it was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation how addictive these things are, as sick as that is. At the same time, no, I hope that I won't go back. I sincerely hope so, for my son's sake.
Mike?
I'm done. I don't think I'll put my family through it anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm done because I don't want to take the risk anymore. I don't want to put my family through it anymore. But more importantly, it's not worth the risk for what we can actually put out as stories. The interest of the public and the interest of the networks and whatever to do the really compelling stories isn't there. It's not worth the risk anymore, I don't think. And I think because of limited access, every time I've gone over there, it's more and more difficult to get good stories, do informative stuff. You're putting people at risk. The Iraqis that you talk to, they're at risk just for speaking with you or being seen with you. The whole situation seems to be so compromised that it just doesn't seem, the risk-reward quotient just isn't there for me anymore.
Jonathan, where do you think we'll be in 2 or 3 years vis-a-vis Iraq?
Boy, I don't know if I have a kind of a last word on that subject. Really, it's sort of imponderable. But it looks as if this crowd is going to study war no more. It's really very striking, very striking. I don't know. It just seems, you know, in Vietnam, you had the opposing side was united. They'd been fighting for several generations against several countries, and only the last was the United States for their independence. They had the backing of 2 superpowers. There was a real strong national unity that prevailed in the end. There was a clear underlying political will of that people to be one country, and they did it. Now, in Iraq, the civil war, Catherine mentioned, I think it was Don mentioned civil war. You don't have such a clear will, and it may be several wills. It may be wills of tribes. It may be wills of those Kurds and Sunnis and Shias. But what's very difficult for me to imagine, and this goes back to my question of what are those troops actually doing now? What is their mission in this situation? Are they trying to get the Shiites and the Sunnis to make friends? What are they doing? It just doesn't seem to me that the United States has anything positive to contribute to whatever this process is going to be. So right now, the way it looks to me is, first of all, the will of, I mean, several of you here have said that, the Americans may want to exit. Certainly I would like to exit yesterday. But whether just sheer weariness, throw up the hands and say, we're out, that's entirely possible. And then just let whatever happens, happens. That's quite possible. But then also with people in Iraq, I don't think it's clear yet what the people there want for themselves, what that sort of underlying will that would be comparable to what the Vietnamese wanted has crystallized as yet. And for instance, right at this moment, I think there's a very deep question. They had that election, which was very surprising. I was surprised by it. But the people elected were elected saying that the United States should leave. And then they got in and said, well, okay, they can stay for a while. Well, how does that play out? In other words, how do those political people, not just the insurgents, but that new political group, feel about the United States presence? I mean, as soon as they say they want the United States to leave, it would seem to me, then the war is over. Then the United States has to leave.
And I think that's going to happen very quickly. I think anyone who covered the election and who's been over there says that the only way that this new government can legitimize itself is to ask the United States to start to leave. They know who these insurgents are. They know where they live. You can't have a military trying to root out insurgents. That has to be done on a local level. And one contrast, I think, wearing kind of both hats in this panel, being both a journalist and having been a military person, is in Vietnam, you'd hear a field grade officer say, it's the only war we got, let's enjoy it. They had no idea what the whole geopolitical scheme of this thing was. They were clueless. Whereas this group of officers are far more competent, far more knowledgeable about the world. When we wanted to find out some real information about what was going on, we wouldn't ask Bremer's CPA. We'd go to the military guys. These guys were more students of the Middle East. They understood the tribal situation. They understood the politics. They understand, they call it 4GW, fourth generation warfare. It's a warfare of insurgency. We've never won one. The French haven't won one. The Soviets haven't won one. And today's military, they know they can't win this one. All they can do, you say, John, what are they doing there, is trying to set up a political situation where somebody can win and they can exit. I think this thing's going to wind down very quickly because I think we're going to be asked to leave. And unlike Vietnam, you're not going to have a military who is saying, well, can't we stay here a little bit longer and make our careers? I think everyone wants to be out of there.
Right.
Well,
I know that the troops I was with, I mean, their primary goal was just to get back home. They quite literally were not bloodthirsty killers wanting to go out and kill some Iraqis. They wanted to accomplish a mission to get back home, and I identified with that quite a bit because I didn't particularly want to be there either. I just kind of wanted to get back home also. And I completely concur with that. And while, regardless of how you feel about the war, and I would hope that we're all opposed to it, and I can assure you my politics make me quite at home at Berkeley, at the same time, I'm quite proud of our troops, and I hope we all are as well. So,
well, on that somewhat more optimistic note, the last few speakers, join me in thanking the panel for being here tonight.